In Spanish, if you are soltero or soltera, you're single. That is to say, you are not married or in a relationship. And appropriately enough, this adjective and noun is singular in form and history in the Spanish language for two reasons. Firstly, it's part of what we call a doublet, more on that in a moment. And second, because it shows us a lot about the history of Spanish sound changes. How? Well, stick around to find out. As a general rule, languages inherit most of their vocabulary from their parent language. Most of Romanian comes from Latin, and most of Swedish comes from Old Norse, for example, so on, so forth. Interestingly enough, English actually might be the exception to this rule. Some estimates say that about 60% of English ultimately derives from Latin, which is astonishing for a Germanic language. And of course, a lot of that Latinate vocabulary comes more immediately from French after the Norman conquest of 1066. English, interestingly enough, is an excellent example of how languages tend to enrich their vocabulary. That is, adoption from other languages. In the case of English, as I mentioned, most of our base vocabulary comes from Germanic, but we've borrowed a lot of Latin and Romance vocabulary across the centuries. But what happens if you borrow from your source language? Well, that produces what we call doublets. And in fact, this happens quite a lot in the Romance languages. Because of the prestige of Latin, for example, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, in fact, all the way up until well into the 19th and even 20th century, Latin was the language of erudition, of the church, of poetry, and of cultivation. And so it's natural that throughout the history of the Romance languages, Romance language speakers, philologists, and linguists especially, reintroduced a lot of words from Latin back into their own language. And this creates doublets. Soltero is an excellent example of this. Comment down below if you know what the other pair of soltero's doublet actually is. I also find it ironic that soltero is one of that exclusive set of words that isn't actually single. It's coupled with another unit to form a pair. But comment down below if you already know what that other unit is before I reveal it. One of the chief features of doublets, as we've implied earlier, is that one of the words is inherited through natural evolution of the language, and the other is introduced later. The word introduced later tends to conserve the form of the original Latin much more closely. And because of this chronological gap between the inheritance of the one unit of the doublet and the introduction of the other, they often differ both in form and semantically. That is to say, they have slightly different meanings. And the doublet we're looking at today, of course, is soltero. And if you haven't already guessed what the other unit of this pair is, solitario. And this is interesting because not only do soltero and solitario have slight semantic differences, as I've referred to already, soltero actually defies the sound change chronology that is widely accepted by Spanish experts. But before going into the semantics, let's look at these sound change laws. There are two that interest us here. The first is the voicing of intervocalic plosive consonants. So when a Latin plosive was between two vowels, the tendency in Spanish and in Portuguese, in fact, was to voice them. This is why Latin lupus becomes lobo and Latin lacus becomes lago. We made a video about this already, so you can check that out on our channel. The other sound change is syncope, when an interconsonantal vowel in an unstressed syllable disappears. And we actually made a video about that as well, and so you can check that out on our channel if you want to get a clearer breakdown of this particular sound change. Now, one of the things we can know with a relatively high degree of certainty is that the voicing of the unvoiced consonant occurs long before syncope does. And we know this largely through attestation. For example, the Latin dominicum, referring either to a Sunday or things associated exclusively with Sunday, was written in the 11th century as dominigo. So it's kept that vowel, that extra vowel, that E in dominigo, but has voiced the K sound. Now, Ramón Menéndez Pidal assures us of this, and I couldn't find attestation outside of one of his works. But one of the things we are certain of is that the Corpus Diacrónico del Español from the Real Academia Española indicates that some 2 centuries afterwards, we can find in the second of Alfonso X's famous Siete Partidas, Dominigo has already changed to Domingo. And so there we have it. Within the space of about 2 centuries, we've seen first the voicing sound change occurred, and then afterwards syncope took place. And this is a generalized phenomenon. For example, the Latin Gallicus, referring to the breed of dog we would today call a greyhound, was written as Galligo in the 11th century. And again, 2 centuries later, the word crops up in its modern form in a collection of documents from the Fuero de Salamanca. There are some even earlier attestations for galgo, the modern form, in León, but that actually might be more in Astur-Leonés than necessarily Old Castilian. And of course, many of you won't forgive me if I don't also mention that galgo is present in one of the most famous opening lines of Spanish literature. Perhaps it's one of the most famous opening lines of literature generally, Don Quijote, when we read that no ha mucho tiempo que vivía un hidalgo de los de lanza y astillero, adarga antigua, rocín flajo y galgo corredor. So this is the norm for the sound change. Voicing occurs first, and then syncope follows. But you may have already realized that soltero bucks this trend. That plosive consonant t has not been voiced and transmuted into the modern d. But why did soltero seemingly skip a step in the evolution of Spanish? The answer seems to lie, in fact, in late Latin. And maybe even not that late Latin. In fact, it seems that soltero is part of a whole cluster of Latin vocabulary that had already been syncopated quite early on. In fact, we may even be talking about as early as the 3rd century AD. The word from which the modern Spanish adjective suelto comes from the Latin soltus. And we know that in non-classical Latin, I'd like to avoid using the term vulgar Latin for obvious reasons, was being pronounced as something like soltus, as early as I mentioned as the 3rd century AD. So it's highly likely that the Latin solitarius, which referred to being solitary, being alone, being single, in the modern sense of the Spanish word, was being pronounced as by commonplace speakers of late Latin as something like soltario or soltarius. And then, of course, gradually over time, transformed into the modern Spanish soltero. And because that lateral alveolar proximant l and the plosive t were right next to each other, it didn't create the conditions required for voicing. Because, as we mentioned, of course, in order for a lot of these unvoiced consonants to be voiced, they had to be intervocalic in the first place. The syncope removed the vowel that was required to make t intervocalic. That's why it's soltero and not soldero, as one might expect if it followed the normal chronology of Spanish sound change. And then, perhaps because it had changed so much from its original solitarius, soltero received a sibling born out of time, when solitarius was reintroduced into the Spanish language as solitario. Now, naturally, we don't know who reintroduced it into Spanish vocabulary exactly, but it can certainly be imputed to the classicizing movements that Spanish and all the Romance languages, in fact, most European languages, were subject from time to time since the fall of the Roman Empire. But what I find particularly interesting is the semantic difference between the two. So we've already mentioned how soltero or soltera means unmarried, single. It refers to a social or even a civil state, whereas solitario is more metaphorical. It's more, reflects a psychological or emotional state of being lonely. And this is actually a semantic tendency with doublets in general. I'd like to discuss this in a further video, but one of the norms is that the inherited word usually has a more concrete, immediately experienced meaning. Contrast, for example, the inherited Spanish artejo to the reintroduced artículo, which has a more formal, academic, metaphorical, or even abstract meaning. If you know of any doublets that you find particularly interesting in the Spanish language or in any other language, in fact, especially if it's a Romance language, comment them down below. I'd like to hear more about them as I prepare for making an entire video on doublets in the Spanish language. For now, I'd like to thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you in the next video, and I hope to see your comments and respond to them. But until then, I will say hasta luego y adios.